I can't imagine what would be going through someone's mind. You know you're being marched to your death. Thinking about the things you don't get to do maybe, the loved ones you're leaving behind.
He says, you're not a bad person. I forgive you for what you're about to do.
He was at a very vulnerable point in his life. She became somebody that he confided in. That eventually grew into a friendship, which eventually grew into something more.
We discovered this affair that has been taking place.
Que dijo, mira, dice, eso sí te puedo decir, dice, si no sea para mí tu hijo, que no sea para nadie.
I'm trying to figure out what's her involvement. But then the plot thickens.
She was also married, which complicated things a lot more.
She wove this tale of being this damsel in distress, and he wanted to be her knight in shining armor.
He goes, something in me will tell me don't do it, you're gonna get in trouble.
They decided to kill. No remorse, no sympathy.
She used him, and he rose to the bait. It's an unforgivable act, and one that justice demands that they fully pay for.
California's Central Valley is a picturesque landscape that serves as a gateway to the Sierra Nevada mountains.
We get a lot of tourists through here with Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, but the primary industry is agriculture.
There is a lot of farmland, a lot of great vineyards, a lot of orchards like peaches and different types of stone fruit, orchards that go on for miles.
A lot of people who have been here have sacrificed. They have come from very far away to build their lives with absolutely nothing in their pockets other than a hope and a dream.
When Kings County receives a 911 call from a worried mother, Tomasa Reyes, on April 4th, 2016, they soon realize this family's American dream might be turning into a nightmare. Tomasa is searching for her son, 40-year-old church pastor Abraham Gaspar Reyes.
Por la semana que trabajaba en el Senger, ahí le rentó un cuartito con su amigo, mamá, de lunes a el viernes o al sábado.
He worked for a chicken plant out in Sanger, which is in Fresno County in California. On the weekends, he'd spend with his parents, and they lived in Hanford, California, which is in Kings County.
Si trabajaba el sábado, llegaba hasta el sábado en la tarde.
He would oftentimes give the Sunday sermon at his church. And about 1:30 in the afternoon after church, he had told his mom and his stepdad that he was going to go get a tire fixed on his vehicle. And unfortunately, that's the last they ever heard from him.
Me levanté de la mañana el lunes y ya no estaba su troca. Los domingos él nunca duerme a la calle. Entonces yo le dije a mi esposo, le dije, levántate. Y mi esposo se levanta en la cama, ¿cómo que no llegó? Sí, ya se fue a buscarle, a ver si había tenido un choque o dónde fue.
With no sign of Abraham anywhere around their small town, his mother pleads with deputies for help finding him.
We ended up sending other detectives to his parents' house so we could get a little more information.
Algo malo ha de pasar. Llegaron los detectives a mi casa el lunes en la tarde, vinieron dos, preguntar cómo era mi hijo y yo le di todos los datos. Le enseñé la foto de su trocas y todo eso. Y pues así ya andaba yo investigando a ver por dónde estaba.
Originally from Oaxaca, Mexico, Abraham Gaspar Reyes grew up with his mother Tomasa, his stepfather Malicio, and his younger sister.
Malesio had a farm, so Abraham was exposed to, the farm life, the animals, the agriculture, and Malesio was also a pastor. So this is where Abraham got his inspiration to become a man of God.
iba mucho a la iglesia. Y aquí lo vine a traerlo a la iglesia y le gustaba mucho aprender cosas de Dios, le gustaba mucho a rezar, a cantar. Cosas de Dios le encantaba mucho desde la edad de 5 años para adelante, le encantaba.
After high school, Abraham stayed active in his local church and dreamed of having a family of his own.
Abraham met his wife, Mari, and he really fell in love with her, and they ended up having 2 beautiful children.
Era muy buena, muy amable, que era buena esposa. Y pues tenía una niña también cuando llegó con él, pero él lo registró su apellido.
In 2005, Abraham made the difficult decision to leave his wife and children behind while he searched for better opportunities in America.
Abraham wanted to provide a better life for his kids. Living in Oaxaca, there was not a lot of access to education or more opportunities.
He came to America to provide for his family, like many of those people who come from other countries and stay, to be able to make a better future than what they were having where they once was.
Abraham joined his parents in the town of Hanford, California.
Cuando él dejó al mexicano, le digo, ok, vamos pues. Y lo llevé en el field a trabajar.
They would hoe the cotton, take out all the weeds. But Abraham didn't only do that. Whatever job was available in the field, he was more than capable.
Abraham always planned to return to his wife and children in Mexico.
Él le mandaba todo dinero, porque era su sueño nomás llegar, tener su casa y regresar allá con su familia.
Being a migrant worker, being by yourself, basically starting from scratch, took him a lot longer than he imagined. And during this time, his wife decided to end their relationship. For Abraham, it was very painful. He came here in search of a better life to provide for his wife, and that was something that was extremely hurtful for him. So Abraham was in the process of a divorce.
Abraham turned to his faith, finding solace at a local church.
At the time, I was the Sunday school teacher, and then Abraham shows up, and he was very intelligent. He was very knowing of God's word, and so he became very helpful in my ministry.
Y ya empezó a tener mucho amistad con los jóvenes. Le gusta mucho platicar, que el maravilloso es el Dios, que esto, lo otro. Y así, hasta que hubo una oportunidad que él empezó a pastorear a las iglesias.
He wanted to help the community, and the kids or the young people at the church really looked up to Abraham as a mentor.
Now, nearly 11 years after immigrating to America, the beloved pastor has gone missing, and law enforcement is speaking to his concerned parents.
We take the initial information from the family. At that point, that BOL goes out nationwide.
The following day, 2 field workers are tending to an almond orchard in nearby Early Mart, California, when they come across an alarming sight.
They were going down the row, and they came across a body. When they got closer, it was very apparent that the person wasn't alive.
They ended up calling 911, advised dispatch. Dispatch ends up calling more officers to the scene.
When we get there, the one thing that I remembered right off the bat was seeing this individual laying there, and he looked like he had left some type of a formal event.
It was someone who stood out. It wasn't somebody that was in the field, or say like a farm worker that had a heart attack or passed out because of the heat or something like that.
As I approached, I could see that he had a gunshot wound to his head. There was evidence of insect activity, which indicated that he had been there most likely for a day or so.
We start checking for identification to see if he has anything on him so we could identify him.
We recovered the wallet. I went through it and I located a bank card and a Mexican consular identification card to Abraham Gaspar Reyes.
Based upon height, weight, all the identifying information on his license, it appeared consistent. Yeah, that's him. He had taken a gunshot to his right temple that went through his head and exited out the left.
The way that Abraham died, it was execution style. This was not something that could be mistaken for anything else. It was just cold-blooded murder.
Coming up, investigators uncover a possible motive in the murder of Abraham.
She would not allow him to look at another woman, to talk to another woman.
It would make sense that there was a jealousy component to this.
And a suspect comes clean.
It's kind of that old saying, confession is good for the soul. He spilled everything.
Just one day after he was reported missing, 40-year-old pastor Abraham Gaspar Reyes has been found dead in an almond grove in Tulare County, California.
There were footprints where it looked like the ground was wetter when they had been made and the ground had sort of dried since. He also had dried dirt on the bottom of his shoes.
It was pretty apparent that he walked into the orchard of his own volition. We located a shell casing at the scene, which was able to quickly tell us that our suspicions were correct and that he was murdered at that location. It was a spent .44 caliber.
To pull the trigger on a large gun like that, it doesn't happen accidentally, because it takes some force to pull the trigger.
About 2 miles away from the orchard, there is a vineyard there. And in front of that, they found a truck belonging to Abraham Gaspar Reyes. There was a cell phone, there was like a jewelry box, but it was all just sitting on the seat.
We were able to get the vehicle and take it as evidence. Obviously go through with the photographing, collecting, and whatnot.
We try to find out as much as we can, as in anybody that might have been involved or might have wanted him hurt. And usually family is the best resource that we could get because they're the ones that know him the best.
That morning, investigators returned to the home of Tomasa and Malicio Reyes to deliver the heartbreaking news.
This family was devastated. Both mom and dad. Both mom and dad were extremely upset.
Me puse triste, sí, me dolió porque es mi hijo. Sentía que todo el mundo se cayó sobre mí. Sentí que todo se acabó para mí, pero Dios me dio esa fuerza, me dio ese valor de seguir adelante.
At this point, we don't know what a motive is. So we're really trying to determine why was he killed. The picture that was drawn for us was that Abraham was a pretty decent guy. He was an assistant pastor at his church, and he was somebody that was respected within his community and very loyal to his family. While we were talking, we discovered that he was separated from his wife and that he had 2 children in Mexico.
No se divorció, pero cuando ya supo ella que estaba en trámite de divorcio.
Abraham's parents say his failing marriage had been a source of stress for him. Another recent incident had also troubled Abraham, and it involved a new girlfriend, 40-year-old Angelita Reyes.
Y lo llevé en el field a trabajar y ahí conocemos a mujer, era mayordoma. Y entonces ella empezaba a hablarles.
Angelita Reyes had 2 children at that time, 9 and 12 years of age, 2 boys, and was recently separated from her husband. They had been separated for about 7 months.
Abraham was at a very vulnerable point in his life, and Angelita came in. She was giving him attention and she was cooking for him, and having that rejection from his wife, she really came in and filled in that void for him. She became somebody that he confided in. That eventually, grew into a friendship, which eventually grew into something more.
Dice ella, yo quiero a tu hijo. Le digo, yo no puedo decir que él quiera porque él tiene todavía su esposa.
So not only did Abraham have this complicated relationship with his wife, Angelita was also married, which complicated things a lot more. Angelita began attending church with Abraham. She would sit in the pews and watch him preach.
All the people from the church would go to him and he would hug them and be very outgoing. After he started to date or see Angelita, he became very much reserved.
His demeanor totally changed, even with me. And I was old enough to be his mom, grandma even. He totally changed. She would not allow him to look at another woman, to talk to another woman, young or old.
There was one argument in particular. There was a big argument between Abraham and Angelita, and Tomasa was there.
Que dijo, mira, dice, eso sí te puedo decir, dice, si no sea para mí tu hijo, que no sea para nadie.
And that struck her weird at the time, but of course she didn't think much of it. But now it's like, well, wait, the way that Angelita said it was almost kind of, malice in it.
The senior pastors at the church had tried to keep them apart because they knew Abraham still had his own children in Mexico and his wife, and they did not think it was a good idea for Abraham to be preaching during that time.
So this was not something that was looked at lightly by the church or his congregation.
He was in this dating relationship with Angelita from October, I believe, of 2014 through January of 2016.
Investigators learned that Abraham had ended his relationship with Angelita in order to focus on his ministry and his marriage with Mari.
He was fighting the flesh, He wanted the life of a pastor. He came back and he told the pastor, I'm back, pastor, this time for good. Everything in my life that was the hindrance is now gone.
La última vez que me dijo, dice Mari, que ahora sí va a venir para acá, dice. Ya tengo planes, ella ya tiene dinero para venirse para acá, ya le mandé. Ok, pues mijo, le dije, está bien.
For investigators, news of Abraham's romantic entanglements amounts to two promising leads.
It was very clear that this was an execution. It would make sense that there was a jealousy component to this.
So they needed to track down Mari and Angelita to see if they had any type of involvement in this.
Less than 48 hours into the murder investigation of 40-year-old Abraham Gaspar Reyes, police are exploring two possible persons of interest: Abraham's wife, Mari, and his ex-girlfriend, Angelita Reyes.
They were able to track down Mari, Abraham's wife, in Mexico. They learned that their relationship was in good standing.
The wife finally wanted to come to the United States to be with him.
We discovered that they were still communicating, they were still talking, but that basically she was there, he was here.
She had never been here, and so she was ultimately eliminated as a suspect from his murder.
Investigators next travel to the registered address for Angelita Reyes. When they arrive, her husband, Javier, agrees to speak to them. but he claims Angelita moved into an apartment of her own 7 months earlier.
Angelita had been married with Javier Garcia, and just one day she up and left him, saying that he wasn't a fun person anymore, and she left. Angelita did tell Javier that she had been seeing Abraham.
When asked if Angelita could have anything to do with Abraham's murder, Javier is quick to say no.
He did not think she was a violent person.
Investigators immediately go to Angelita's new apartment in Bakersfield.
They did find her down in Bakersfield. They asked her to come with them because at that point she was a suspect, but they didn't know if she was responsible. She readily agreed.
At the station, Angelita is escorted to an interview room.
She was very comfortable and sitting there and talking, and like almost to the point where she was flirting with the investigators.
She talks about, that she has a husband, they're not divorced, but they've been separated for a long time, that they have children together. She then talks about how she was dating Abraham, but she tries to make it that she called it off. Well, tell us about Abraham. Tell us about, the last time you talked with him. And she said, oh yeah, well no, I did talk to him on the phone Saturday night, but I didn't see him.
She denies meeting or seeing Abraham on the day that he went missing. So probably an hour or so into the interview, Angelita agrees to take a voice stress analyzer, which for all intents and purposes is a lie detector test.
The test suggests Angelita is lying about the last time she saw Abraham. So they pressure her to come clean.
The investigators went back at her a second time, and when confronted with this information, she finally starts to talk.
She said, well, we got together Sunday, April 3rd, which was the last day he was seen alive. And then she's like, Abraham was blackmailing me. And the detective goes, tell me more about that. She's like, well, he took naked photos of me and made these videos of me and was threatening me because I broke up with him. He was threatening me to make them public if I didn't get back together with him. This doesn't fit the narrative of who Abraham is as a person that's being presented by every other person who knew him.
What she said made no sense. We didn't necessarily believe Angelita's statement.
That's when Angelita tells police that she had confided in her roommate, 22-year-old Jesus Jeronimo.
They work at the packing house together, working in farm labor.
She then eventually admits that, oh yeah, they were kind of dating.
Angelita and Jesus started dating soon after she and Abraham broke up in January of 2016.
She said that Jesus was a jealous man and he wanted to harm Abraham because he didn't like how Abraham was treating Angelita.
Angelita claims that on Sunday, April 3rd, she had plans to meet up with Abraham alone.
Abraham had some jewelry of Angelita's from the relationship, but after they had broken up, Angelita had then wanted that jewelry back.
She says, I went on my own on Sunday, April 3rd to meet with Abraham in early March. I traveled alone. She says, all of a sudden, Jesus Jeronimo shows up and he's just in a rage. And she said that Jesus walked Abraham at gunpoint into the field and shot him and walked away.
She had said that she didn't get out of the car, she didn't see what happened, and we really didn't believe that.
By then, the detectives are like, did he really come separate? She starts changing her stories.
And it's just obvious that she is telling one lie after another after another. I say let them lie. Eventually you're going to be out of excuses and the truth's going to come out.
I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's her involvement? At that point, I'm wondering, is she the actual killer?
2 days into the murder investigation of Abraham Gaspar Reyes, his ex-girlfriend, Angelita Reyes, has just admitted that her new boyfriend, Jesus Jeronimo, shot and killed Abraham after he allegedly blackmailed her.
According to her, she did not know that Jesus intended to shoot or kill Abraham. She said she was innocent of that. She was just interested in getting her jewelry back and trying to reconcile maybe and be friends.
But then the plot thickens in this case.
As Angelita's story takes yet another turn, she admits to investigators that it wasn't her jewelry, but a plan concocted by Jesus that brought Abraham out to meet her at a remote location with no witnesses.
So as she's trying to claim this "oh woe is me," she eventually says that Jesus had her call Abraham to set him up. Tell him that her truck isn't working. They even put the hood of the truck up. He then tells her, "You stay here." Jesus goes and hides. So Angelita waits, and Abraham arrives. So Abraham gets out of the vehicle. Unbeknownst to him, Jesus springs out from his hiding spot.
He's now being confronted by Jesus with the firearm, and that's where he's shot and killed. She admitted to being present when Jesus Jeronimo shot Abraham. She finally tells what happens, but she is making it as if the whole thing was planned by Jesus and that it was his idea.
But Angelita insists she thought the plan was to simply scare Abraham.
She finally ended up throwing Jesus under the bus and blamed him for everything.
She was just very confident that she was fine and there was nothing wrong with what she had done.
It was very apparent that she was so sure she was going to leave that she actually at one point asked them, "So, are you going to pay me for my time?"
While Angelita is held in custody, authorities immediately get Jesus Jeronimo on the phone.
We somewhat did a ruse because we called Jeronimo and we said, "Hey, Angelita's ready to be picked up from the police department, come and pick her up." So when he showed up to pick her up, that's when we took him under custody.
Once in the interview room, investigators ease into their line of questioning by getting to know the suspect.
During our conversation, he said that he was born in Long Beach, in California. From there, his family ended up moving to Wasco to go work in agriculture. He told me that he had met Angelita about a year ago and that they worked together in Delano.
Jesus really didn't have anybody in this world. He was alone. He didn't have an education. He didn't have anybody to look up to or any type of, positive role models in his life. And Angelita, she stepped in. She was all these things for him.
She taught him how to work. She taught him a lot of skills that he believed were skills that his father should have taught him, but his father never did. So he, was fond of her.
When investigators confront him about the murder of Abraham Gaspar Reyes, Jesus begins to crack under the pressure.
His demeanor, you could tell something was bothering him. And we said, "Well, what did you do?" He went on to say that he was tired of Abraham threatening or intimidating Angelita. Always worried that some photos or video was gonna be leaked out to her ex-husband and to her children.
He's like, "I just need it to stop. I need Abraham to stop torturing Angelita."
He said all that weekend, he started thinking about it. He had made his mind up that he was gonna kill him. So he ended up speaking with a co-worker and said, "Hey, can I borrow a gun?"
He had this friend, Arturo, who was the one who provided the weapon.
He stated that when Arturo got there, Jesus said, "Hey, I don't know how to use a gun." So Jesus said Arturo gave him a tutorial, left him with a loaded gun that Arturo made sure was fully loaded, and said, "Wait, you're still just gonna scare him. You're not gonna do anything else, right?"
Jesus said that he was a very stubborn person And once that thought went into his mind, there was no convincing him otherwise.
Jesus claimed that he asked Angelita to set a time to meet with Abraham, and Angelita was more than happy to comply.
Jeronimo said they were going to tell Abraham to meet him in Early Mart in the outskirts and say that the car broke down. And he went across the street and hid in a grape vineyard.
And when Abraham arrived, he jumped out of his hiding spot. He said he pepper sprayed Abraham. He held Abraham at gunpoint, and that he drove him nearby to the almond orchard.
He says that as they're walking, he's still covering his face because of the pepper spray. That Abraham tells him, you're not a bad person. I forgive you for what you're about to do. This is not your work. This is the devil's work.
I can't imagine what would be going through someone's mind. You know you're being marched to your death, thinking about the things you don't get to do maybe, the loved ones you're leaving behind.
Jesus goes, I raised a gun, I put it right next to his head, and something in me was telling me, don't do it, you're gonna get in trouble. And he goes, I pulled the trigger.
Tulare County investigators are questioning 22-year-old Jesus Jeronimo, who has cracked under the pressure of investigators about the murder of beloved pastor Abraham Gaspar Reyes.
Some dam inside him, emotional dam, just broke. And it's kind of that old saying, confession is good for the soul. He spilled everything.
He goes, when I pulled the trigger, I seen him going back. But I didn't want to have that image engraved in my head, so I looked away, and I left.
He stated he walked back to the car, and he told Angelita basically, it's done. And they drive back to the home of Arturo, give him back the gun. And he says, then we went to get empanadas.
Well, they rolled right into the rest of their day, like nothing had ever happened. It just came off as very cold and heartless.
We arrested Jesus and Angelita. My office charged them with murder. Then they were both charged with a special circumstance of lying in wait.
To help build their case against Jesus and Angelita, investigators tracked down the man who provided the murder weapon, 37-year-old Arturo Pompa.
He admitted that Jesus did contact him that afternoon and asked for him to meet down in Early Mart and to bring the gun. Arturo said that every time he had talked to either Angelita or to Jesus, it was just that they needed to scare Abraham so that he would stop trying to torture Angelita with these sex tapes. He said Jesus asked, hey, I need you to show me how to work this. Arturo was somebody who wanted to help, and so he agreed and showed him how to use it.
Arturo says he went home and was visited by the couple later that day.
Arturo then said that later that afternoon, Jesus and Angelita arrived at his home and brought back the gun. That he didn't look at the gun at all, he just put it back in the case in the way that it was given to him and stuck it up on the shelf in his closet. The detectives ask, hey, can we see this? Can you give us this gun? And he pulls out the box.
It was a Desert Eagle 44 Magnum. It was consistent with shell casing located at the scene.
You look at the gun and you look down that barrel. There's apparent bodily matter in it. There's blood, skin. There even appears to be like chunks of little bone. So nothing was done to that gun from the time it was used to kill Abraham till the time it was placed in that box and put up on that shelf. Arturo tries to just kind of minimize his involvement, but they ultimately arrest him.
With Angelita Reyes, Jesus Jeronimo, and Arturo Pompa now in custody, investigators obtain a search warrant for the couple's apartment and cell phones.
Angelita was claiming that Abraham was blackmailing her with a number of photos and sexually explicit videos.
We never located any images that would suggest that that happened. We never located anything on social media that says that any of these threats had ever taken place or that there was any indication that he'd done anything like that at all. There was no evidence that Abraham was anything other than a stand-up individual.
Based on Angelita's whole personality and her controlling of Abraham, our belief is that she put Jesus up to it.
Jesus Jeronimo was 22 years old at this time, nearly half the age of Angelita Reyes.
So, is it possible that Jesus could have done it to prove his manliness to Angelita?
We ended up taking Jeronimo's cell phone. And on that cell phone, he had an ongoing conversation in Spanish with Pompa. And it went from, I'm tired of this fool, I want to break him, he's doing this too much and I can't take it anymore, to, hey, can I borrow the gun?
Jesus really did believe that it was Abraham who was harassing her, who was following her. But in essence, it was the opposite. It was Angelita who was after Abraham. It was Angelita who was pursuing Abraham. And this whole time, Jesus was fooled.
She wove this tale of being this damsel in distress, and he wanted to be her knight in shining armor.
There's no denying that she was equally as culpable.
Four days after discovering the body of California pastor Abraham Gaspar Reyes, Tulare County investigators have gathered incriminating data from the cell phones of Abraham's ex-girlfriend, 40-year-old Angelita Reyes, and her new boyfriend, 22-year-old Jesus Jeronimo.
We did what we called CDRs, call detail records from cell providers. So we take those call detail records and we have them put into what's called CellHawk. And when they plugged them into that system and they started to map them, you clearly see Angelita and Jesus' cell phones traveling in tandem from Bakersfield.
You see then Angelita and Jesus' phones move that couple of miles to where the almond orchard is, and then leave, presumably to where they went and got those empanadas.
Investigators now have enough to press charges. On May 25, 2016, Angelita Reyes and Jesus Jeronimo are both charged with murder. Their gun runner, Arturo Pompa, is also charged with murder.
In California, if you take part in a homicide, you can be charged the same as everybody else. How much he took part in the actual killing of Abraham is unclear.
The best part of making the arrests on this case, we're getting to go back and tell Mom and Dad that the persons that were responsible for Abraham's death were going to be held accountable.
No le guardé rencor ni le guardé odio, simplemente le dije, pedí Dios mío, ¿por qué? Pero que Dios lo perdone y que la ley que tiene que hacer lo que van a hacer, justicia, yo no puedo hacer nada.
In July 2018, Angelita Reyes, Jesus Jeronimo, and Arturo Pompa's joint trial gets underway.
What was interesting about this trial is that all three defendants were on trial at the same time. So they were all sitting at the defendant's table at the same time.
In this case, the defense jointly took a strategy. They decided absolutely that Angelita and Arturo were going to testify.
They were trying to show that Abraham did threaten Angelita. He was making her life miserable, but none of that was proven.
Instead, it was Angelita who was the aggressor.
Angelita was extremely jealous. So Abraham was in the process of a divorce, and he was still sending money to Mexico to his wife. And this was something that sent her over the edge.
Prosecutors assert that following their breakup, Angelita used 22-year-old Jesus Jeronimo to settle the score.
Angelita was a mastermind. He had nothing to gain by killing Abraham except to gain Angelita.
She used him and he rose to the bait. It's an unforgivable act and one that justice demands that they fully pay for.
On July 20th, 2018, a Tulare County jury finds both Angelita Reyes and Jesus Jeronimo guilty of first-degree murder. Arturo Pampa, however, is acquitted of all charges.
Arturo supposedly provided the handgun for this homicide, but he did not pull the trigger. And I think a jury probably felt they didn't know how much Arturo might have taken part in the actual killing, moving of the body, or even luring him to that location. It comes down to the killer couple of Angelita and Jesus, because they're the ones that actually did the killing.
Jesus pulled the trigger, but she set the wheels in motion and essentially laid the trap.
This idea that she's being blackmailed with a sex tape is contrived. It's so she can control Jesus, so that she can get what she wants. Because if she couldn't have Abraham, no one could.
They decided to kill Abraham. They did it in no remorse, no sympathy for him or the family.
Yo no deseo a nadie que pase los dolores que pasé, porque es un dolor triste, pero esa es mi felicidad que está con Dios, que ahí está mejor lugar que acá, que aquí hay mucha maldad en el mundo.
Abraham was a very loving and caring person. He wanted the best for everybody, and I will miss him greatly. He was not just a friend, he was not just a pastor, but to me, he was my brother.
I want to remember Abraham as the true man of God that he was. I wish I had a young man like him with his fire, that could be a part of the ministry. Good man and will be missed.
On the morning of November 24th, SIL 1987, investigators in Washington state were called to separate scenes that, at first glance, appeared to have no obvious connection. Near a rural roadway in Skagit County, the body of a young man was discovered in a ditch. Approximately 60 miles away, in a wooded area near Monroe in Snohomish County, the body of a young woman was found later that same day. Both victims were young Canadians. Both had left home only days earlier with plans that seemed ordinary and hopeful. Neither family could have imagined that a journey intended to begin a new chapter of life would instead become one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring cold cases. What investigators did not yet know was that these two crime scenes marked the beginning of an investigation that would span more than 3 decades before advances in forensic science finally revealed the identity of the person responsible. The victims were identified as 20-year-old Jay Cook and 18-year-old Tanya Van Cuylenborg, residents of British Columbia, Canada. According to family members and investigators, the young couple had traveled south into Washington state on November 18th, SIL 1987. Their purpose was practical rather than recreational. They were transporting materials related to a furnace installation for relatives in Seattle, a task expected to take only a short time before they returned home. Friends and family later described them as responsible young adults with plans for the future. Their sudden disappearance quickly drew concern because remaining out of contact without explanation was entirely out of character. Investigators reconstructed the couple's planned route using witness interviews, receipts, and other available records. The journey required crossing the international border into Washington before continuing toward the Seattle metropolitan area. During the late 1980s, cross-border travel between British Columbia and Washington was a routine part of life for many residents of the region. Families visited relatives, businesses operated on both sides of the border, and countless travelers made the trip every week. Nothing about Jay and Tanya's travel plans suggested unusual risk. There was no indication that they anticipated danger or believed they were being followed. Their trip began as an ordinary family errand, making the events that followed all the more difficult for investigators and relatives to understand. When the couple failed to return as expected, concern rapidly escalated. Families contacted authorities, and investigators in both Canada and the United States began gathering information regarding the couple's last known movements. Cross-border investigations presented unique challenges, requiring coordination between agencies operating under different jurisdictions while maintaining a shared objective of determining what had happened. Detectives interviewed relatives, friends, employers, and anyone who might have interacted with the couple during the days before their disappearance. Every detail, no matter how small, was carefully documented in an effort to establish an accurate timeline. The discovery of Jay Cook's body in Skagit County immediately transformed a missing persons investigation into a homicide inquiry. Crime scene investigators secured the location, photographed the surrounding area, documented physical evidence, and began reconstructing the circumstances under which the victim had arrived there. At approximately the same time, investigators working the second scene near Monroe were conducting similar procedures after the discovery of Tanya Van Quillenborg. The separation between the two locations suggested that the offender had moved between multiple sites, increasing the complexity of the investigation. Detectives now faced not one crime scene but several, each potentially containing evidence essential to identifying the person responsible. Forensic investigators worked methodically according to the standards of the period. They documented tire impressions where present, photographed vegetation, collected trace evidence, and preserved biological material for laboratory examination. Although DNA profiling had not yet become a routine investigative tool in 1987, experienced investigators understood the importance of preserving every available piece of physical evidence. Biological samples, fibers, fingerprints, and other materials were collected whenever possible, following established forensic procedures designed to maximize future investigative opportunities. Those careful decisions made during the earliest hours of the investigation would ultimately prove critical many years later. Autopsy examinations provided investigators with important information regarding the circumstances surrounding the deaths. The findings helped establish approximate timelines and confirmed that both victims had been the subjects of violent criminal acts. Medical examiners documented their observations carefully, contributing essential forensic information that would later become part of the long-term investigative record. While many details of the examinations remained appropriately confidential during the active investigation, the overall conclusions reinforced the assessment that the deaths were linked and that investigators were searching for a single offender responsible for both crimes. Attention soon turned toward reconstructing the couple's final known movements. Detectives reviewed witness statements, examined financial records where available, and attempted to identify locations the victims had visited after entering Washington. Businesses, service stations, restaurants, and other public locations along the probable travel route were contacted. Employees were interviewed in hopes that someone might remember seeing the young couple during the days preceding the crimes. In an era before widespread surveillance cameras, mobile phones, and digital financial records, investigators depended heavily upon eyewitness testimony, paper receipts, and careful investigative reconstruction. Establishing a reliable timeline required patience and meticulous attention to detail. One particularly important development involved the discovery of the couple's van. Investigators located the vehicle in the city of Bellingham, Washington. Crime scene specialists processed it extensively, searching for fingerprints, trace evidence, biological material, and signs of struggle or forced entry. The vehicle represented one of the most significant physical links to the victim's final movements, and every effort was made to preserve potential evidence. Detectives hoped that careful forensic examination might reveal who had entered the van or provide clues regarding where the couple had traveled before the crimes occurred. Although the available forensic technologies of the late 1980s imposed important limitations, investigators documented and preserved evidence with exceptional care. The investigation quickly expanded across multiple jurisdictions. Local police departments, county sheriff's offices, state investigators, Canadian authorities, and federal agencies exchanged information as detectives attempted to identify possible suspects. Because the victims had crossed an international border shortly before the crimes, cooperation between American and Canadian investigators became especially important. Detectives compared missing persons reports, reviewed known violent offenders operating in the region, and examined whether similar crimes had occurred elsewhere in Washington or British Columbia. Despite these efforts, no immediate suspect emerged. Media coverage spread rapidly throughout both countries. Newspapers in Washington and British Columbia reported on the murders, publishing photographs of the victims and appealing for witnesses to come forward. Television broadcasts summarized the known timeline and encouraged anyone who had seen the couple or their van to contact investigators. Families publicly appealed for information, hoping that someone might remember an encounter capable of explaining what had happened during the final days of the trip. The case attracted considerable public attention because of its cross-border nature and the apparent absence of any clear motive linking the victims to the offender. As investigators evaluated the available evidence, they confronted numerous unanswered questions. Where had the couple encountered the individual responsible? Had they been specifically targeted, or had the offender selected them opportunistically? How had events unfolded between their departure from British Columbia and the discovery of the crime scenes several days later? Without eyewitnesses capable of identifying the offender and without the advanced forensic capabilities that would emerge years later, detectives found themselves assembling a complex puzzle with many missing pieces. The investigation, nevertheless, continued with determination. Detectives preserved physical evidence, documented witness interviews in detail, compared reports across jurisdictions, and followed every credible lead available. They understood that major homicide investigations often depend upon patience as much as immediate breakthroughs. Although progress during the earliest months proved limited, the careful work completed in 1987 established a foundation that would remain invaluable throughout the decades that followed. Unknown to investigators at the time, evidence collected during those first critical days would survive long enough to be examined by future generations of forensic scientists using technologies that had not yet been invented. The answers sought by Jay Cook's and Tanya Van Quillenborg's families would not come quickly, but the investigation had begun with a level of professionalism and evidence preservation that ensured the possibility of future progress would never be entirely lost. The first weeks following the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg became a race against time. Detectives understood that the greatest opportunity to identify a violent offender often comes immediately after a crime, when witnesses' memories are fresh and physical evidence remains intact. Investigators from multiple Washington law enforcement agencies worked alongside Canadian authorities, comparing reports, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing the victims' final days. Every documented movement, every receipt, every possible sighting, and every piece of recovered evidence became part of an expanding investigative timeline. Yet, despite the intensity of those early efforts, the identity of the person responsible remained unknown. The investigation established that Jay and Tanya had departed British Columbia on November 18, SIL 1987, intending to deliver furnace parts to relatives in the Seattle area. Family members later told investigators that the trip was expected to be straightforward and brief. There was no indication that either young adult planned to remain in Washington for an extended period, nor was there evidence suggesting they feared anyone or believed they were in danger. Detectives found no information indicating that the couple had become involved in criminal activity or had any known conflicts that might explain the violence that followed. This absence of an obvious motive significantly complicated the investigation from its earliest stages. Investigators carefully reconstructed the route the couple was believed to have taken after crossing the international border. During the late 1980s, the Interstate 5 corridor connecting British Columbia and western Washington carried heavy daily traffic. Thousands of travelers crossed between Canada and the United States for work, shopping, tourism, and family visits. Along that route were numerous service stations, restaurants, convenience stores, and rest areas where travelers routinely stopped. Detectives systematically visited these locations, speaking with employees and members of the public who might remember seeing the young Canadian couple during the days before their deaths. One of the most valuable investigative tools available in 1987 remained eyewitness testimony. Before widespread surveillance cameras, GPS tracking, or mobile phone location records, investigators depended heavily on people who happened to notice something unusual. Detectives released descriptions of the victims, their vehicle, and their travel plans through newspapers and television broadcasts. Members of the public responded with numerous tips. Some believed they had seen the couple at businesses along Interstate 5, while others reported possible sightings of the van. Each report required careful evaluation. Investigators compared the information against known facts, eliminating inconsistencies while preserving potentially useful leads for further examination. The discovery of the couple's van in Bellingham became a major focus of forensic examination. Crime scene specialists processed both the interior and exterior with meticulous care. Fingerprints were developed where possible, trace evidence was collected, and biological material was preserved according to accepted forensic standards of the time. Detectives hoped the vehicle would reveal how the offender had gained control of the victims, or whether another individual had traveled inside the van after the couple entered Washington. Although laboratory technology available in the late 1980s could not provide all the answers investigators sought, the evidence recovered from the vehicle was carefully cataloged and retained for future analysis. As investigators compared information from both crime scenes, they began identifying similarities suggesting that the murders were committed by the same offender. The separation of the locations indicated deliberate movement across western Washington, requiring investigators to consider the possibility that the offender possessed familiarity with the region. Detectives examined maps, travel routes, and the geographic relationship between the locations where the victims, their vehicle, and other evidence had been discovered. Geographic analysis during that period relied largely on experienced investigators studying patterns manually rather than using modern computerized crime mapping systems. Even so, detectives recognized that understanding the offender's movements might eventually assist in narrowing the pool of potential suspects. The investigation also required close coordination between medical examiners and homicide detectives. Autopsy findings were integrated with crime scene observations to establish the sequence of events as accurately as possible. Investigators compared timelines, environmental conditions, witness statements, and forensic evidence to estimate when the crimes had occurred. These analyses helped detectives determine which reported sightings remained consistent with the available evidence and which could reasonably be excluded. Such reconstruction formed an essential part of the investigation, allowing law enforcement to focus resources more effectively despite the limited technological tools available at the time. Meanwhile, detectives conducted extensive background investigations into both victims. Friends, relatives, employers, classmates, and acquaintances were interviewed in an effort to identify anyone who might have wished to harm either Jay or Tanya. Investigators examined personal relationships, employment history, financial circumstances, and travel plans. These inquiries consistently reinforced the same conclusion. Nothing in the victim's background suggested an obvious motive for targeted violence. This finding gradually shifted investigative attention toward the possibility that the offender had encountered the couple during their journey rather than through any prior personal relationship. As public interest continued to grow, media organizations in both Washington and British Columbia devoted significant coverage to the investigation. Photographs of Jay and Tanya appeared in newspapers, while television broadcasts summarized known facts and appealed for witnesses. Investigators welcomed responsible public assistance while remaining careful not to release sensitive forensic information that could compromise future interviews or legal proceedings. Balancing transparency with investigative integrity remained an important consideration throughout the case. Despite the substantial resources committed during the early investigation, detectives faced increasingly familiar challenges common to many complex homicide cases. Witnesses who initially believed they had observed the victims often proved unable to provide sufficiently detailed information to identify the offender. Potential sightings could rarely be verified independently. Physical evidence collected from multiple locations required lengthy laboratory examination, and available forensic methods often lacked the discriminatory power that would emerge decades later with advances in DNA science. Detectives pursued numerous investigative leads, yet none produced the evidence necessary to identify a suspect. Investigators also reviewed reports of known violent offenders operating in Washington and neighboring regions during the late 1980s. Criminal histories, parole records, and prior investigations were examined carefully. Detectives compared behavioral characteristics, geographic patterns, and available forensic evidence against individuals previously investigated for violent crimes. While several persons of interest were evaluated over the years, none could be linked conclusively to the murders through the evidence available at the time. Each elimination represented responsible investigative practice, narrowing the field while reinforcing the need for additional evidence. By the end of the initial investigative phase, law enforcement had assembled an extensive body of information. Detectives had reconstructed much of the victim's intended journey, identified the locations where critical evidence had been recovered, processed the van thoroughly, interviewed numerous witnesses, coordinated internationally with Canadian authorities, and preserved biological evidence with exceptional care. Yet the central question remained unanswered. Who had encountered Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg during their trip through Washington, and why had an ordinary cross-border journey ended into homicides separated by dozens of miles? Although no arrest had been made, investigators refused to classify the case as forgotten. The files remained active, evidence was maintained according to evolving forensic standards, and detectives continued reviewing new information whenever credible leads emerged. They recognized that unresolved homicide investigations sometimes require years before scientific advances or previously unavailable evidence create new opportunities. Unknown to everyone involved in 1987, the biological evidence preserved during those first meticulous examinations would eventually become the foundation for one of the most significant breakthroughs in modern cold case investigation. The investigation had reached its first major obstacle, but the careful work completed during those early months ensured that the search for answers would continue long after the initial leads had faded. As months turned into years, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg gradually entered a category every homicide investigator hopes to avoid: an active case with no identifiable suspect. The initial surge of public attention diminished, newspaper headlines became less frequent, and investigative resources inevitably shifted toward newer crimes requiring immediate response. Yet within filing cabinets, evidence lockers, and laboratory archives, the investigation remained very much alive. Detectives continued to believe that the person responsible had left behind traces capable of revealing an identity. The challenge was that the scientific tools necessary to interpret that evidence had not yet fully developed. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, forensic DNA analysis was still emerging as a practical investigative technique. While scientists had demonstrated the potential of DNA profiling, its routine use in criminal investigations remained limited compared with later decades. Laboratories faced technical constraints, available databases were small or non-existent, and analytical methods continued to evolve. Detectives assigned to the Cook-Van Quillenborg investigation recognized that biological evidence recovered during the original investigation might eventually prove significant, but they also understood that immediate answers were unlikely. Consequently, preserving that evidence became a priority equal to following traditional investigative leads. Throughout the early years of the investigation, detectives periodically reviewed witness statements collected in 1987. Memories were compared, timelines re-examined, and previously overlooked details evaluated in light of new information. Investigators revisited locations associated with the case, interviewed individuals again when appropriate, and examined whether changes in forensic science might justify additional laboratory testing. Such reviews are common in complex homicide investigations. Fresh perspectives can sometimes identify patterns or inconsistencies that were not immediately apparent during the original inquiry. Although these efforts produced valuable clarification regarding certain aspects of the timeline, they did not identify the offender. The cross-border nature of the investigation continued to require cooperation between authorities in Washington state and British Columbia. Detectives exchanged information concerning violent offenders, missing persons investigations, and related criminal activity occurring on either side of the international border. Because Jay and Tanya had departed Canada shortly before the crimes occurred, investigators carefully examined whether any events in British Columbia might be connected to the murders. Extensive background inquiries, however, continued to support the conclusion reached during the original investigation. There was no verified evidence suggesting that either victim had been specifically targeted because of their personal lives or prior relationships. Attention also focused on whether the murders might be linked to other violent crimes committed in the Pacific Northwest during the same period. Detectives reviewed homicide investigations involving young travelers, examined reports of assaults occurring near major highways, and compared available behavioral evidence with crimes committed by known offenders. Such comparisons required caution. Similar circumstances alone cannot establish a connection between cases. Investigators therefore relied upon objective forensic evidence, documented timelines, and corroborated investigative findings when evaluating potential links. Although several possibilities were examined over the years, none could be confirmed through available evidence. One recurring challenge involved the absence of modern digital investigative tools. In 1987, there were no mobile phone records capable of reconstructing the victims' movements, no widespread surveillance camera networks documenting travel, and no electronic toll systems recording vehicle locations. Financial transactions were primarily paper-based, and computerized investigative databases remained limited compared with contemporary systems. Detectives therefore relied heavily upon interviews, handwritten records, physical evidence, and careful reconstruction of travel routes. These limitations were not unique to this investigation. They reflected the investigative environment of the era. Nevertheless, they significantly complicated efforts to identify an unknown offender encountered during a routine journey. Despite these obstacles, forensic laboratories continued preserving biological evidence collected from the victims, the crime scenes, and the recovered vehicle. As DNA technology advanced throughout the 1990s, scientists revisited previously collected samples to determine whether improved analytical methods could produce additional information. Incremental progress occurred as laboratory capabilities expanded, allowing investigators to develop increasingly informative DNA profiles from preserved evidence. Each advancement strengthened the scientific foundation of the investigation, even though no immediate suspect was identified. The establishment and expansion of criminal DNA databases also generated cautious optimism. Detectives submitted eligible forensic DNA profiles according to applicable legal procedures, hoping that future comparisons might identify an offender already represented within those systems. Over time, additional convicted offenders entered national databases, increasing the likelihood that unsolved cases could eventually produce direct matches. Investigators periodically requested updated comparisons whenever database capabilities expanded. Year after year, however, the results remained unchanged. No qualifying offender profile matched the DNA recovered during the Cook-Van Quillenborg investigation. Each unsuccessful search narrowed certain investigative possibilities while confirming that the individual responsible had either never submitted a qualifying DNA sample or was otherwise absent from available databases. The emotional impact of the unresolved investigation remained significant for the victims' families. Relatives in British Columbia continued seeking answers regarding the events of November 1987 while maintaining communication with investigators. Whenever new developments occurred, law enforcement agencies recognized the importance of preserving these relationships, understanding that families often possess valuable historical knowledge capable of assisting future investigative reviews. Although decades passed without an arrest, investigators assured relatives that the case remained open and that preserved evidence would continue to be examined as scientific capabilities improved. Within law enforcement, the investigation became an example of why unresolved homicides require long-term commitment. Detectives assigned to cold case units inherited extensive investigative files prepared by earlier generations of investigators. They studied original reports, reviewed crime scene photographs, analyzed laboratory findings, and familiarized themselves with every documented lead pursued since 1987. New investigators frequently approached historical evidence with fresh perspectives while respecting the careful work completed by those who had conducted the original investigation. This continuity ensured that institutional knowledge was preserved even as personnel changed over the years. By the early 21st century, forensic DNA technology had advanced dramatically compared with the methods available when the crimes occurred. Laboratories possessed improved capabilities for analyzing degraded biological samples, generating more complete genetic profiles, and comparing evidence against expanding national databases. Yet, despite these remarkable scientific advances, the central obstacle remained unchanged. No direct database match identified the unknown offender. Investigators now possessed reliable forensic evidence connecting the crimes to a single individual, but they still lacked a name. Rather than discouraging investigators, this situation reinforced their confidence that the answer likely remained within the preserved evidence itself. Detectives increasingly believed that the case would eventually depend not upon discovering new physical evidence, but upon finding innovative ways to interpret the evidence already collected decades earlier. The careful decisions made during the original investigation, preserving biological samples, maintaining chain of custody, documenting crime scenes thoroughly, and retaining investigative records had protected the integrity of the case through years of scientific progress. Although no one could predict precisely when or how the breakthrough would occur, investigators remain convinced that future advances might finally reveal the identity hidden within the DNA evidence collected in 1987. That belief would ultimately prove justified, but before science could provide the answer, the investigation would first endure many more years as one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring and meticulously preserved cold cases. By the early 2000s, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg had officially become one of the Pacific Northwest's longest-running cold case investigations. More than a decade had passed since the crimes, yet the central facts remained unchanged. Investigators knew who the victims were. They had reconstructed much of their intended journey from British Columbia into Washington, and they possessed valuable physical evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes. Most importantly, advances in forensic biology had confirmed that preserved biological material contained a DNA profile believed to belong to the unknown offender. What investigators still lacked was the one piece of information that could transform the investigation: a name. Cold case investigations differ fundamentally from newly reported crimes. Rather than responding to fresh evidence and recent witness accounts, detectives spend much of their time reassessing historical information. Every interview transcript, laboratory report, crime scene photograph, evidence inventory, and investigative memorandum must be examined repeatedly, often by investigators who were not involved in the original inquiry. The Cook-Van Quillenborg investigation entered this stage as experienced detectives retired and newer investigators inherited thousands of pages of carefully documented records. Their responsibility was not to begin the investigation again, but to build upon the work already completed while applying modern forensic techniques wherever appropriate. One of the greatest strengths of the investigation remained the quality of the original evidence preservation. Biological samples collected in 1987 had been maintained according to evolving forensic standards, allowing laboratories to conduct increasingly sophisticated DNA analysis as technology advanced. Unlike many historical investigations in which evidence had deteriorated or been lost, this case retained materials capable of supporting additional scientific examination. Laboratory scientists periodically reevaluated preserved samples, seeking improved DNA profiles as analytical methods became more sensitive. Each refinement strengthened investigators' confidence that the offender could eventually be identified if an appropriate comparison became possible. The development of the Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS, represented an important milestone in American forensic investigation. CODIS enabled participating laboratories to compare forensic DNA profiles against profiles obtained from qualifying convicted offenders under applicable legal requirements. Detectives assigned to the Cook Van Quillenborg case submitted the available forensic DNA profile through established procedures, hoping that a direct match would identify the unknown offender. Each time the database expanded, investigators requested updated comparisons. The expectation was straightforward. If the individual responsible were later convicted of another qualifying offense and required to provide a DNA sample, the system might automatically generate a match. Year after year, however, those comparisons produced no identification. The absence of a database match suggested several possibilities. The offender might never have been convicted of a qualifying crime requiring DNA collection. He might have committed offenses in jurisdictions where DNA had not been obtained. He might have died before submitting a DNA sample, or he could simply have avoided future contact with the criminal justice system. Detectives considered each possibility carefully while recognizing that none altered the underlying forensic evidence. The DNA profile remained reliable. It simply did not correspond to anyone currently represented within available criminal databases. Meanwhile, investigators continued reviewing information concerning known violent offenders active in Washington and neighboring regions during the late 1980s. Criminal histories were examined, geographic movements compared, and available forensic evidence evaluated whenever potential suspects emerged. Several individuals attracted investigative attention at various times, often because of similarities in criminal behavior or geographic proximity. Yet responsible homicide investigations require evidence rather than coincidence. Detectives systematically compared each candidate against the forensic findings, witness statements, and established timeline. Those who could be excluded through objective evidence were removed from consideration, allowing investigators to focus resources elsewhere. The victims' families remained closely connected to the investigation despite the passage of time. Detectives maintained communication whenever meaningful developments occurred, explaining new forensic procedures and discussing opportunities created by scientific advances. Although decades had passed, relatives consistently expressed the hope that modern technology might eventually succeed where traditional investigative methods had reached their limits. Their continued cooperation proved important, both emotionally and practically, reinforcing the long-term partnership between investigators and those directly affected by the crimes. Public interest in the case also persisted through periodic media coverage. Newspapers and television stations occasionally revisited the investigation on significant anniversaries or when advances in forensic science prompted renewed attention to unresolved homicides. These reports often generated additional public tips, some involving individuals previously unknown to investigators. Every credible lead received careful evaluation. Detectives recognized that even information arriving many years after the crimes could potentially contribute to the investigation. While most tips ultimately proved unrelated, maintaining an open investigative posture remained essential in a case where no possibility could be dismissed without examination. During the first decade of the 21st century, forensic science continued advancing at a remarkable pace. Laboratories developed improved methods for extracting DNA from increasingly small or degraded biological samples. Analytical software became more sophisticated, allowing scientists to interpret complex genetic mixtures with greater reliability. Quality assurance standards expanded, strengthening confidence in laboratory conclusions presented within the criminal justice system. These developments benefited numerous cold case investigations across the United States, encouraging detectives to preserve evidence carefully and request renewed testing whenever appropriate technological improvements became available. Despite these scientific advances, investigators working the Cook-Van Queilenborg case encountered the same fundamental obstacle. The offender's DNA profile remained unidentified because no direct database comparison produced a match. Detectives increasingly recognized that solving the case might require an investigative approach extending beyond conventional criminal DNA databases. At that time, however, no widely accepted method yet existed for identifying an unknown individual through distant biological relatives. The scientific breakthrough that would eventually transform the investigation had not yet entered routine law enforcement practice. Within forensic and investigative communities, discussions gradually emerged concerning new possibilities created by the rapidly growing field of consumer genealogy. Millions of individuals were voluntarily submitting DNA samples to learn about family ancestry, while genealogists became increasingly skilled at constructing extensive family trees using public historical records. Initially, these developments appeared largely unrelated to criminal investigation. Their primary purpose involved family history rather than forensic identification. Nevertheless, some researchers and investigators began recognizing that shared genetic relationships might one day assist in identifying unknown individuals when, combined with careful genealogical research and independently verified evidence. At the time, these ideas remained largely theoretical within mainstream homicide investigations. Detectives assigned to the Cook-Van Queilenborg case continued relying upon established investigative methods while monitoring developments in forensic science. They preserved evidence meticulously, maintained detailed case documentation, reviewed historical investigative files, and remained prepared to evaluate any scientifically validated technique capable of generating new leads. Their patience reflected a principle familiar to experienced cold case investigators. Scientific progress cannot be predicted, but evidence preserved with care retains its value regardless of how much time passes. By the middle of the 2010s, nearly 3 decades had elapsed since Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg had crossed the Canadian border expecting an ordinary family trip. The investigation remained unsolved, yet unlike many historical cases, it possessed something exceptionally valuable, a complete, reliable DNA profile from the unknown offender preserved through years of careful forensic work. Investigators understood that the answer likely already existed within the evidence collected in 1987. What remained uncertain was whether science had finally advanced far enough to reveal the identity concealed within that genetic profile. The next chapter of the investigation would answer that question in a way few detectives could have imagined when the case first began. By the mid-2010s, the investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg had reached a critical turning point. Nearly 30 years had passed since the crimes occurred, yet investigators had preserved something of extraordinary value, a reliable DNA profile believed to belong to the offender. Conventional investigative methods had been exhausted. Witness interviews had been conducted and revisited. Crime scenes had been documented extensively. Potential suspects had been evaluated and eliminated through objective evidence. DNA comparisons against criminal offender databases had repeatedly produced no direct match. Despite decades of dedicated investigative work, the identity of the individual responsible remained unknown. Increasingly, detectives recognized that solving the case would require a fundamentally different approach. At the same time, developments outside traditional law enforcement were transforming the field of human genetics. Millions of individuals had voluntarily submitted DNA samples to commercial ancestry services in order to learn about their family origins. Many users also uploaded their genetic information to public genealogy databases that allowed comparisons among relatives. These databases were designed to connect families separated by generations, helping individuals discover cousins, construct family trees, and explore shared ancestry. Although never intended as criminal investigative tools, they demonstrated an important scientific principle. Even distant relatives often share identifiable segments of DNA that can reveal common ancestors. A small number of forensic researchers and genealogists began exploring whether this principle might assist in identifying unknown individuals connected to criminal investigations. The concept became known as investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional forensic DNA database searches, which seek an exact match between crime scene evidence and an existing offender profile, investigative genetic genealogy examines partial genetic relationships between an unknown individual and people who have voluntarily shared their DNA under database policies permitting such comparisons. The method does not identify a suspect directly. Instead, it generates investigative leads by identifying distant relatives, after which genealogists construct family trees using publicly available historical records such as birth certificates, marriage records, census information, obituaries, and other documented sources. Investigators assigned to the Cook van Queilenborg case recognized that their preserved DNA evidence might be suitable for this emerging methodology. Before proceeding, forensic laboratories carefully evaluated whether the available biological material met the technical standards required for genealogical analysis. The objective was not to replace conventional forensic investigation, but to generate new investigative leads capable of directing detectives toward previously unknown individuals. Importantly, investigators understood that genealogy alone could never establish criminal responsibility. Any potential suspect identified through family tree analysis would still require independent forensic confirmation and corroborating investigative evidence before legal action could be considered. Specialists converted the preserved forensic DNA profile into a format appropriate for genealogical comparison. Once completed, the profile was compared against genealogy databases operating under policies that permitted law enforcement use for serious violent crime investigations. The initial results did not identify the offender directly. Instead, they revealed several distant biological relatives whose shared DNA suggested common ancestry with the unknown individual. For experienced genealogists, these partial relationships represented the beginning rather than the conclusion of the investigative process. Constructing family trees required painstaking historical research. Genealogists examined publicly available records extending back multiple generations, documenting births, marriages, deaths, residential histories, military service, immigration records, and other genealogical information. Family branches expanded rapidly, sometimes encompassing hundreds of individuals connected through common ancestors. Every documented relationship required independent verification before being incorporated into the evolving family tree. Investigators remained careful to distinguish documented facts from assumptions, recognizing that genealogical research demands the same commitment to accuracy expected throughout criminal investigations. As family trees became more complete, detectives and genealogists worked together to narrow the number of potential individuals. Candidates were evaluated using objective criteria established through decades of investigation. Age became an important factor because investigators possessed reliable estimates regarding the offender's approximate age during the crimes. Geographic history also received careful attention. Individuals with no documented connection to the Pacific Northwest during the relevant period could generally be excluded. Sex, family relationships, and other independently verifiable historical facts further reduced the pool of possible candidates. Among those whose names emerged during the genealogical analysis was William Earl Talbot III. Public records indicated that Talbot had lived in Washington state during the period relevant to the investigation. His age was generally consistent with investigative estimates developed years earlier, and aspects of his documented history warranted additional review. At this stage, however, detectives emphasized that genealogy had merely generated an investigative lead. No conclusion regarding criminal responsibility could be reached without independent forensic confirmation. As in every responsible homicide investigation, evidence, not genealogical relationships alone, would determine the direction of the case. Investigators initiated discreet surveillance while continuing to review Talbot's documented background. The objective was to obtain a DNA sample that had been abandoned in a public place, allowing forensic scientists to compare it lawfully with the DNA profile preserved from the 1987 crime scenes. Such procedures had become an established investigative practice under applicable legal standards in appropriate circumstances. Detectives understood that the forthcoming comparison would be decisive. If the DNA profiles did not match, Talbot would be excluded just as numerous earlier persons of interest had been. If they matched, investigators would possess compelling forensic evidence linking a suspect to the preserved biological material recovered decades earlier. The laboratory comparison represented the culmination of nearly 30 years of scientific progress. Biological evidence collected in 1987, preserved through changing investigative technologies, analyzed repeatedly as forensic methods improved, and ultimately examined through investigative genetic genealogy, had finally reached the stage where a direct forensic comparison could answer the central question that had remained unresolved for decades. Scientists conducted the analysis according to established laboratory standards, maintaining rigorous quality assurance procedures and documenting every stage of the examination. Detectives awaited the results while continuing preparations for whatever investigative steps might follow. When the forensic comparison was completed, the findings demonstrated that the DNA obtained during the investigation matched the DNA profile preserved from the evidence collected in connection with the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg. After nearly 3 decades without a suspect, investigators had identified an individual through the combined application of traditional detective work, meticulous evidence preservation, advances in forensic DNA analysis, and investigative genetic genealogy. The breakthrough represented one of the earliest major successes of this emerging investigative method in the United States and provided renewed hope not only for the families of Jay and Tanya, but also for investigators responsible for countless other unresolved homicide cases across North America. Although the identification marked an extraordinary milestone, experienced detectives recognized that the investigation was entering a new phase rather than reaching its conclusion. The evidence now had to withstand judicial scrutiny. Prosecutors would carefully evaluate every aspect of the investigation, and the criminal justice process would proceed according to established legal standards. The decades-long search for an unknown offender had finally produced a name, but the responsibility of proving the case in court remained ahead. For the families who had waited since November 1987, the possibility that long-delayed answers might finally emerge had become closer than at any point during the previous 30 years. Yet the pursuit of justice still required the careful, methodical process that had defined the investigation from its very beginning. The identification of William Earl Talbot II marked the most significant breakthrough in the investigation since the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg in November 1987. After more than 3 decades of uncertainty, investigators finally had a suspect whose identity had emerged through investigative genetic genealogy and whose DNA had been independently compared with the biological evidence preserved from the original crime scenes. Yet, experienced detectives understood that a forensic identification alone did not conclude a criminal investigation. Every subsequent step had to comply with established legal procedures, ensuring that the evidence presented in court would withstand rigorous judicial scrutiny. Once the DNA comparison supported the investigative lead, detectives intensified their review of Talbot's documented history, public records, employment information where available, residential history, and other independently verifiable sources were examined alongside investigative files that had accumulated over 3 decades. Investigators sought to determine whether Talbot's known movements during the relevant period were consistent with the timeline established in 1987. They also reviewed historical records to identify any information that might either strengthen or contradict the developing investigative theory. This process reflected a fundamental principle of homicide investigations. Every significant finding must be tested against objective evidence rather than accepted without verification. At the same time, prosecutors began evaluating the case in anticipation of possible criminal charges. Because more than 30 years had passed since the murders, legal preparation required extraordinary attention to detail. Detectives assembled original investigative reports, laboratory documentation, crime scene photographs, witness statements, autopsy findings, and evidence logs maintained since 1987. Every document had to demonstrate an unbroken chain of custody and consistent investigative procedures spanning multiple decades. The remarkable quality of the original documentation proved invaluable. Detectives who had worked the earliest stages of the investigation had preserved records with sufficient precision that modern prosecutors could confidently reconstruct the history of the case. In May 2018, law enforcement officers arrested William Earl Talbot, tenant in Washington state. The announcement attracted immediate attention throughout both the United States and Canada. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg, the arrest represented the first major public development in decades. Investigators emphasized, however, that an arrest marked the beginning of formal judicial proceedings rather than the conclusion of the case. As in every criminal prosecution, the charges would have to be proven in court based upon admissible evidence and established legal standards. Following the arrest, prosecutors charged Talbot with 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Court documents outline the evidence supporting the charges, including the forensic DNA comparisons that had become central to the investigation. Investigators explained publicly that investigative genetic genealogy had served only as the method for generating the initial lead. The evidence supporting the criminal prosecution rested upon independently verified forensic DNA analysis and other admissible investigative findings rather than genealogy itself. This distinction became an important point of discussion within both legal and forensic communities as investigative genetic genealogy gained increasing attention nationwide. Pretrial proceedings involved extensive legal review of the scientific evidence. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the investigation, including issues relating to investigative genetic genealogy and the collection of DNA evidence. Prosecutors responded by presenting testimony regarding laboratory procedures, forensic standards, chain of custody, and the investigative methods used throughout the case. Cortez carefully considered these issues within the broader framework of constitutional protections and evidentiary law. The proceedings reflected the criminal justice system's commitment to ensuring that emerging scientific techniques are evaluated according to established legal principles before evidence is presented to a jury. During the trial, prosecutors presented a comprehensive account of the investigation spanning more than 30 years. Jurors heard testimony from investigators, forensic scientists, medical experts, and other witnesses whose work contributed to the case. Evidence collected in 1987 was examined alongside modern forensic analyses, illustrating how advances in DNA science had transformed preserved biological material into compelling investigative evidence. Prosecutors emphasized the continuity of the investigation, demonstrating how careful evidence preservation and successive generations of investigative work had ultimately led to the identification of the defendant. Forensic testimony played a central role during the proceedings. Laboratory experts explained how DNA profiles are developed, compared, and interpreted according to accepted scientific standards. Jurors were introduced to the methods used to analyze the preserved biological evidence and the procedures followed to compare it with DNA obtained during the investigation. Experts also described quality assurance measures designed to ensure laboratory reliability, including documentation requirements, peer review, and established protocols governing forensic examinations. Their testimony underscored that the conclusions presented in court rested upon validated scientific methodology rather than speculation. Investigators also described the broader history of the case, explaining the challenges associated with conducting a cross-border homicide investigation during the late 1980s. They outlined the extensive witness interviews, crime scene examinations, forensic testing, and investigative reviews completed over the decades. Jurors learned that detectives had pursued numerous investigative leads before ultimately identifying Talbot through advances in forensic science. This historical perspective demonstrated that the prosecution did not rely upon a single investigative technique, but rather upon the cumulative results of decades of careful police work supported by modern scientific analysis. In June 2019, after considering the evidence presented during the trial, a jury found William Earl Talbot saying guilty of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The verdict represented the culmination of one of the Pacific Northwest's longest-running homicide investigations. Later that year, the court sentenced Talbot to 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg, the verdict marked the conclusion of a legal process that had begun more than 30 years after the murders occurred. The case did not end entirely with the trial. In 2022, the Washington Supreme Court reversed Talbot's convictions because of an evidentiary issue unrelated to the DNA identification, concluding that certain evidence admitted during the original trial should not have been presented to the jury. Importantly, the court did not rule that the DNA evidence identifying Talbot was invalid. Instead, it ordered a new trial based on procedural legal considerations concerning the admission of evidence. This distinction became significant in public discussions of the case, demonstrating how appellate courts review not only the strength of evidence, but also whether criminal trials fully comply with constitutional and evidentiary requirements. Rather than proceeding to a second full jury trial, the legal process concluded in 2022 when William Earl Talbot Desn entered guilty pleas to 2 counts of second-degree murder. Under the negotiated resolution, he received a sentence of 45 years in prison. The plea formally resolved the criminal case while avoiding the need for another lengthy trial. For investigators who had spent decades preserving evidence, revisiting case files, and embracing emerging forensic science, the conclusion represented the successful resolution of one of Washington State's most significant cold case investigations. It also established the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg as one of the landmark cases demonstrating the investigative potential of forensic DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy when combined with decades of disciplined police work, careful evidence preservation, and unwavering commitment to following the evidence wherever it ultimately led. The conclusion of the criminal proceedings in 2022 did not mark the end of the historical significance of the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg investigation. Instead, the case quickly became one of the most closely studied examples of how modern forensic science can transform a decades-old homicide investigation. Long before investigative genetic genealogy became widely known, detectives working this case had already demonstrated the importance of meticulous evidence preservation, comprehensive documentation, and continued investigative review. Those foundational efforts allowed later scientific advances to succeed where earlier investigative methods had reached their limits. The case is now frequently examined alongside other landmark cold case investigations as an illustration of how persistence and technology can complement one another within the criminal justice system. One of the investigation's most important lessons concerns the preservation of biological evidence. When investigators collected forensic samples in 1987, they could not anticipate the scientific capabilities that would emerge over the following 3 decades. DNA profiling itself was still in its infancy, and investigative genetic genealogy had not yet been conceived as a law enforcement tool. Nevertheless, crime scene investigators carefully documented, packaged, and preserved biological material according to the best professional standards available at the time. Those routine procedural decisions ultimately became the foundation upon which the entire modern investigation was built. Without preserved evidence maintaining its scientific integrity over decades, no later technological advancement could have identified the offender. The investigation also demonstrated the cumulative nature of successful homicide investigations. Public attention often focuses on dramatic breakthroughs, yet the resolution of this case resulted from thousands of smaller investigative decisions made consistently over many years. Detectives interviewed witnesses, revisited crime scenes, reviewed reports, eliminated suspects, maintained evidence inventories, and periodically reassessed the investigation as forensic science evolved. Every investigator inherited work completed by predecessors and added new information without discarding earlier findings. This continuity preserved institutional knowledge despite changes in personnel, agency leadership, and investigative priorities. Following the resolution of the case, law enforcement agencies across North America examined the investigative methods used throughout the inquiry. Training academies incorporated the investigation into courses addressing cold case management, homicide investigation, forensic evidence preservation, and interdisciplinary cooperation. Rather than emphasizing only the eventual DNA identification, instructors highlighted the broader investigative process. Students learned that successful cold case investigations rarely depend upon a single scientific breakthrough. Instead, they require careful evidence collection, disciplined documentation, objective analysis, and a willingness to revisit historical cases whenever validated scientific advances become available. The investigation likewise became an important example within forensic science education. Laboratory professionals studied the case to demonstrate how preserved biological evidence can retain investigative value for decades when maintained under appropriate conditions. Advances in DNA extraction, amplification, sequencing, and statistical interpretation all contributed to the eventual identification of the offender. But those advances depended entirely upon the quality of the original evidence collected in 1987. The case reinforced the importance of rigorous laboratory procedures, comprehensive documentation, chain of custody integrity, and quality assurance throughout every stage of forensic analysis. Investigative genetic genealogy attracted significant public attention following the identification of William Earl Talbot II. Researchers, legal scholars, forensic scientists, and policymakers examined the case as one of the earliest high-profile demonstrations of the method's practical investigative value. At the same time, professionals emphasized an important distinction repeatedly illustrated throughout the investigation. Genealogical research generated an investigative lead, but it did not establish criminal responsibility. Detectives still obtained independent forensic DNA evidence, conducted additional investigative work, and presented scientifically validated evidence through the judicial process. This distinction remains central to professional guidance governing the responsible use of investigative genetic genealogy today. The case also contributed to broader discussions concerning privacy and the appropriate use of genealogy databases. As public awareness increased, genealogy service providers reviewed their policies regarding law enforcement access to voluntarily submitted DNA data. Several organizations introduced clearer consent procedures, allowing users to decide whether their information could be available for investigations involving serious violent crimes or unidentified human remains. Legal scholars continued examining constitutional and statutory considerations while recognizing the significant investigative value demonstrated by cases such as the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. These discussions remain active as forensic genetics continues to evolve. For the families of the victims, the legal resolution represented the end of an extraordinarily long chapter. More than 3 decades had separated the murders from the identification of the offender. During that period, relatives remained in regular contact with investigators, responded to requests for information, participated in interviews, and continued hoping that advances in forensic science might eventually produce answers. Their patience reflected a reality familiar to many families affected by unresolved homicide investigations. Cold cases rarely remain emotionally dormant. Instead, unanswered questions often persist across generations, making eventual investigative progress deeply significant regardless of the passage of time. The investigation also highlighted the importance of international cooperation. Because Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were Canadian citizens whose journey brought them into Washington state shortly before the crimes, investigators from both countries remained engaged throughout the case. Information sharing between Canadian authorities and law enforcement agencies in Washington strengthened the investigation from its earliest stages. The case illustrated how effective cross-border cooperation can enhance complex investigations involving multiple jurisdictions while maintaining consistent investigative standards. Within the broader history of forensic science, the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation represents a transitional period between traditional homicide investigation and the emerging era of advanced genetic analysis. Detectives who began the investigation relied primarily on witness interviews, physical evidence, geographic reconstruction, and conventional laboratory examinations. Successive generations of investigators gradually integrated DNA profiling, computerized evidence management, expanded forensic databases, and eventually investigative genetic genealogy into the same investigative framework. Rather than replacing traditional detective work, these technologies enhanced it, allowing preserved evidence to answer questions that had remained unresolved for decades. Today, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg are remembered not only because the offender was ultimately identified after more than 30 years, but because the investigation fundamentally demonstrated the enduring value of professional investigative practice. Every preserved piece of evidence, every carefully written report, every documented witness interview, and every periodic review contributed to the eventual resolution. The investigation stands as a reminder that justice in complex homicide cases often depends upon persistence rather than speed. Scientific innovation may provide new investigative tools, but those tools achieve their greatest value only when combined with disciplined evidence preservation, objective analysis, interagency cooperation, and an unwavering commitment to follow verified facts wherever they led. These principles, demonstrated throughout the investigation, continue to guide cold case detectives and forensic scientists working to resolve violent crimes that have remained unanswered for years, offering hope that careful work performed today may one day provide long-awaited answers for other families still waiting for justice. As the investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg entered the historical record, it became increasingly valuable not only as a solved cold case, but also as a case study in the evolution of homicide investigation. Criminal justice researchers, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and law enforcement agencies examined the investigation to better understand why it ultimately succeeded after more than 3 decades. Their conclusions consistently pointed toward the interaction of several essential factors: careful evidence preservation, patient investigative review, scientific innovation, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and strict adherence to evidentiary standards. None of these elements alone would likely have solved the case. Together, they created the conditions that allowed long-preserved evidence to identify an offender many years after the crimes occurred. One of the investigation's most enduring contributions involves the changing philosophy surrounding cold case management. During much of the 20th century, unresolved homicide investigations often remained largely inactive unless new witnesses emerged or unexpected evidence appeared. As forensic science advanced, however, agencies increasingly recognized that historical evidence itself could become more informative over time. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrated that technological progress should be viewed as an investigative opportunity rather than merely a scientific development. As DNA methods improved, detectives repeatedly returned to preserved evidence, asking not whether the evidence had changed, but whether science had become capable of revealing information that was previously inaccessible. This shift influenced how many law enforcement agencies organized their investigative resources. Dedicated cold case units became more common, bringing together experienced detectives, forensic scientists, crime analysts, prosecutors, and victim advocates. Rather than waiting passively for new leads, these teams systematically reviewed historical investigations, evaluated whether preserved evidence qualified for renewed forensic testing, and monitored emerging scientific methodologies. The investigation involving Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg became one example supporting this proactive approach. It illustrated that unresolved homicide investigations remain capable of producing significant breakthroughs decades after the original crimes when evidence has been carefully maintained. The case also reinforced the importance of comprehensive records management. Detectives working the investigation inherited extensive documentation created by earlier investigators, including witness interviews, crime scene photographs, laboratory reports, evidence inventories, maps, and investigative memoranda. Each generation of investigators added new information while preserving the integrity of existing records. This continuity allowed modern investigators to reconstruct investigative decisions made many years earlier and evaluate them using contemporary scientific knowledge. Agencies reviewing the case frequently cited this documentation as one of its greatest strengths, demonstrating that thorough record-keeping remains essential regardless of available technology. Forensic laboratories likewise viewed the investigation as evidence of the long-term value of evidence preservation. Biological samples collected in 1987 continued yielding useful information because they had been stored appropriately and subjected to rigorous chain of custody procedures. As laboratory techniques advanced, scientists repeatedly extracted additional information from the same preserved materials without compromising their integrity. This progression highlighted a fundamental principle of forensic science. Preserved evidence may possess future value beyond what contemporary technology can immediately reveal. Consequently, many laboratories strengthened evidence retention policies, recognizing that scientific advances often occur more rapidly than anticipated. The investigation also contributed to ongoing professional discussions regarding investigative genetic genealogy. While the technique generated substantial public attention following several high-profile cold case identifications, professionals consistently emphasized its proper role within criminal investigations. Investigative genetic genealogy functions as an investigative lead generation method rather than a substitute for conventional forensic evidence. In the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation, genealogical research narrowed the field of potential individuals, but investigators still obtained independent DNA evidence and followed established legal procedures before making an arrest. This distinction became central to subsequent professional guidance governing responsible application of the methodology. Legal scholars examined the case from another perspective, focusing on the relationship between emerging technology and constitutional protections. As investigative genetic genealogy became more widely discussed, courts and policymakers considered questions concerning privacy, evidentiary reliability, and lawful investigative practice. The investigation demonstrated that while technological innovation can significantly expand investigative capabilities, its use remains subject to judicial oversight, statutory requirements, and established constitutional principles. These discussions continue to shape policies governing forensic genetics across multiple jurisdictions. The role of victim advocacy also received renewed attention following the resolution of the investigation. Families of homicide victims often remain connected to investigations for decades, particularly when cases remain unsolved. Throughout the Cook Van Cuylenborg investigation, detectives maintained communication with relatives whenever meaningful developments occurred, explaining new forensic procedures and investigative progress as appropriate. This long-term relationship illustrated the importance of treating families not simply as witnesses, but as individuals whose lives continue to be profoundly affected by unresolved violent crime. Many agencies have since expanded victim services within cold case units, recognizing the value of sustained communication and support. Another important lesson emerged from the investigation's international dimensions. Because the victims were Canadian citizens traveling in the United States, effective cooperation between Canadian and American authorities remained essential from the earliest stages of the inquiry. Investigators shared information, coordinated investigative efforts, and maintained communication despite operating under different legal systems and administrative structures. The successful collaboration demonstrated that jurisdictional boundaries need not become barriers to effective homicide investigation when agencies commit coordinated information sharing and mutual professional respect. Educational institutions have likewise incorporated the case into criminal justice curricula. Students studying forensic science examine the laboratory methods employed throughout different stages of the investigation, while criminal justice programs analyze investigative decision-making, evidence preservation, and interdisciplinary cooperation. Law schools review the legal proceedings associated with the prosecution, including evidentiary issues addressed during appellate review. The investigation therefore serves as an interdisciplinary teaching resource, illustrating how scientific, investigative, and legal principles interact within complex homicide cases. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the investigation lies in the confidence it provided to detectives responsible for other unresolved homicides. Every cold case presents unique circumstances, and no scientific method guarantees success. Nevertheless, the Cook Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrated that carefully preserved evidence may retain investigative value for decades, even when contemporary technology appears insufficient. The case encouraged agencies across North America to preserve biological evidence diligently, revisit historical investigations periodically, and remain attentive to validated scientific advances capable of generating new investigative opportunities. Today, more than 3 decades after Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg began what should have been an ordinary trip from British Columbia into Washington, their case continues to influence modern criminal investigation. It reminds professionals that justice often depends upon sustained commitment rather than immediate results, that scientific progress can transform historical evidence into powerful investigative tools, and that the careful work performed by one generation of investigators may ultimately enable another generation to complete the search for answers. In that sense, the investigation extends beyond its own historical significance, continuing to inform forensic science, investigative practice, and cold case methodology while offering enduring lessons for those committed to resolving violent crimes that have remained unanswered for far too long. The resolution of the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg reached far beyond the courtroom. Within the law enforcement community, the case quickly became a benchmark for evaluating how modern investigative practices should be applied to long unsolved homicides. Detectives responsible for cold case units across the United States and Canada closely studied the investigation, recognizing that its success was not the product of a single breakthrough, but rather the culmination of decades of disciplined, investigative work supported by scientific advancement. Every stage of the inquiry reinforced a principle familiar to experienced investigators. Evidence carefully preserved today may reveal answers only after future generations develop the technology capable of interpreting it. One of the most important operational lessons involved evidence management. Crime scene investigators in 1987 collected biological material, documented physical evidence, maintained detailed chain of custody records, and preserved exhibits according to the best forensic standards available at the time. Those procedures were routine professional responsibilities, yet their long-term significance became extraordinary. More than 30 years later, that same evidence remains suitable for sophisticated DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy. As agencies reviewed the case, many strengthened policies governing evidence retention, recognizing that biological samples previously considered of limited value might become critically important as laboratory science continued to evolve. The investigation also highlighted the necessity of comprehensive documentation. Throughout the decades-long inquiry, detectives maintained extensive files containing witness interviews, forensic reports, crime scene photographs, investigative notes, laboratory analyses, maps, correspondence, and evidence inventories. Successive investigators inherited these records, allowing each generation to build upon previous work rather than repeating it. Institutional continuity proved especially valuable because personnel inevitably changed over the course of more than 3 decades. Retired detectives passed knowledge to their successors through carefully prepared documentation, ensuring that investigative history remained accessible long after the original investigators had left active service. Another enduring lesson concerned the value of periodic case reviews. Many cold case investigations remain unsolved, not because evidence is absent, but because available scientific techniques have not yet reached the level necessary to interpret that evidence effectively. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrated that technological advancement itself should prompt renewed investigative review. As DNA analysis improved throughout the 1990s and early 21st century, investigators repeatedly reassessed preserved evidence, asking whether modern laboratory methods could generate additional information. This philosophy has since become standard practice in many dedicated cold case units, where unresolved investigations are routinely revisited as forensic science develops. The investigation likewise emphasized the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation. Detectives, forensic biologists, crime analysts, prosecutors, genealogists, evidence technicians, medical examiners, and victim advocates all contributed specialized expertise at different stages of the case. No single discipline could have resolved the investigation independently. Instead, progress depended upon integrating scientific analysis, investigative experience, legal oversight, and historical research into a coordinated strategy. This collaborative model has influenced the structure of many contemporary cold case teams, which increasingly combine professionals from multiple disciplines to maximize investigative effectiveness. Forensic genealogy became one of the most widely discussed aspects of the investigation, yet professionals consistently emphasized its limited and carefully defined role. Investigative genetic genealogy generated a lead by identifying distant biological relationships within publicly available genealogy databases operating under applicable policies. Genealogists then constructed documented family trees using historical public records. However, this process alone did not identify the offender with legal certainty. Detectives still conducted traditional investigative work, obtained independently verifiable DNA evidence, and followed established legal procedures before making an arrest. The distinction remains essential because genealogy functions as an investigative tool rather than as courtroom proof of guilt. Legal scholars also examined the investigation because it illustrated the interaction between emerging scientific techniques and established constitutional protections. Cortez evaluating the case addressed procedural issues while reaffirming the importance of evidentiary reliability, due process, and judicial oversight. The Washington Supreme Court's 2022 decision reversing the original convictions focused on the admission of certain evidence during trial rather than rejecting the scientific validity of the DNA identification itself. The subsequent guilty pleas resolved the criminal proceedings while demonstrating that procedural fairness remains a central component of the American justice system, regardless of the strength of forensic evidence. The case further strengthened international cooperation between Canadian and American law enforcement agencies. Because Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg were Canadian citizens whose journey brought them into Washington shortly before the murders, authorities from both countries remained engaged throughout the investigation. Information sharing, coordinated communication, and mutual investigative assistance allowed detectives to reconstruct the victims' backgrounds and travel plans more effectively than would have been possible within a single jurisdiction. The investigation therefore serves as an example of successful cross-border cooperation in the investigation of serious violent crime. Victim advocacy professionals also cite the investigation when discussing long-term family support. Families affected by unresolved homicide often endure years of uncertainty while investigations continue. Detectives maintained communication with relatives over decades, providing updates whenever meaningful developments occurred and explaining advances in forensic science that might influence the investigation. This sustained relationship reflected an evolving understanding within law enforcement that unresolved cases remain emotionally significant for families regardless of how much time has passed. Modern victim-centered investigative practices increasingly recognize the importance of consistent communication throughout lengthy investigations. Educational institutions have incorporated the case into professional training programs across several disciplines. Criminal justice students examine the investigation as an example of evidence preservation and investigative persistence. Forensic science programs analyze laboratory procedures, DNA interpretation, and quality assurance practices demonstrated throughout the case. Law schools discuss appellate review, evidentiary procedure, and constitutional considerations arising from the prosecution. Genealogy professionals study the family tree reconstruction methods employed during the investigation, while police academies emphasize the importance of objective investigative reasoning and meticulous documentation. Few cold case investigations have contributed so broadly to professional education across multiple fields. Perhaps the investigation's greatest legacy is the confidence it has provided to detectives working other unresolved homicides. Every cold case differs in its available evidence, legal circumstances, and investigative challenges. Not every investigation possesses preserved biological evidence suitable for advanced DNA analysis, nor will every case ultimately benefit from investigative genetic genealogy. Nevertheless, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg demonstrated that scientific innovation can dramatically expand investigative possibilities when evidence has been preserved carefully and investigative integrity has been maintained over time. The case encourages detectives to continue preserving evidence, reviewing historical investigations, and embracing validated scientific developments without abandoning the traditional principles of objective inquiry that have long defined professional homicide investigation. More than 3 decades separated the murders from the final legal resolution, yet the investigation remains a powerful reminder that justice is often measured in persistence rather than speed. The careful decisions made by investigators in 1987, photographing crime scenes, preserving biological evidence, documenting witness statements, and maintaining complete investigative records ultimately allowed future generations of forensic scientists and detectives to accomplish what had once seemed impossible. Today, the case continues to guide investigators confronting unresolved violent crimes, demonstrating that while technology will continue to evolve, the enduring foundations of successful criminal investigation remain constant. Integrity, patience, scientific rigor, meticulous documentation, collaboration, and an unwavering commitment to follow the evidence wherever it leads. As the investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg became part of modern forensic history, its influence extended well beyond the agencies directly involved in the case. Detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, legal scholars, and policymakers increasingly viewed the investigation as a demonstration of how the criminal justice system can adapt to scientific innovation while preserving the principles of due process and evidentiary integrity. The resolution of the case did not suggest that every cold case can be solved through advanced DNA technology, but it clearly illustrated that careful investigative work performed decades earlier can create opportunities that future science is uniquely positioned to unlock. One of the investigation's most significant contributions involved changing expectations surrounding unsolved homicide investigations. For many years, cold cases were often viewed as investigations that had reached the limits of available evidence. Unless a witness unexpectedly came forward or a suspect confessed, meaningful progress could be difficult to achieve. The Cook Van Quillenborg investigation demonstrated a different perspective. Rather than treating preserved evidence as static, investigators increasingly recognized that evidence possesses dynamic value because scientific capabilities continue to improve over time. Biological samples collected decades earlier may reveal entirely new information when examined using methods unavailable during the original investigation. This philosophy has influenced how agencies prioritize long-term evidence preservation. Crime laboratories and evidence storage facilities now devote considerable attention to maintaining biological evidence under conditions designed to preserve its scientific integrity for future examination. If custody documentation, environmental controls, digital inventory systems, and standardized retention policies have all become increasingly important components of evidence management. While these procedures require significant institutional resources, the Cook Van Quillenborg investigation demonstrated that investments made in evidence preservation may ultimately determine whether future technological advances can be applied successfully. The investigation also reinforced the importance of objective investigative methodology. Throughout more than 3 decades, detectives received numerous tips, evaluated multiple persons of interest, and considered a wide range of investigative theories. Some leads appeared promising during preliminary review, but were ultimately excluded through objective forensic analysis or independently verifiable evidence. Rather than allowing speculation to influence investigative decisions, detectives consistently relied upon documented facts and scientific findings. This disciplined approach prevented investigative resources from becoming focused on unsupported theories and preserved the credibility of the case throughout its lengthy history. Another lasting lesson concerns the relationship between technology and traditional detective work. Public attention frequently centered on investigative genetic genealogy because it represented a relatively new forensic technique. Yet investigators repeatedly emphasized that genealogy alone did not solve the murders. Instead, it functioned as one component within a much broader investigative process. Traditional police work remained essential at every stage. Detectives reconstructed timelines, reviewed witness statements, examined historical records, coordinated with forensic laboratories, obtained independent DNA comparisons, and prepared comprehensive evidence for prosecutors. Technology expanded investigative possibilities, but experienced investigators transformed scientific information into legally admissible evidence through careful investigative practice. The legal proceedings associated with the investigation have also contributed to ongoing discussions regarding emerging forensic technologies. Cortez examining the case addressed questions concerning evidentiary procedures, constitutional protections, and the proper application of advanced scientific methods within criminal investigations. The appellate review that ultimately led to a new trial order demonstrated an important principle of the justice system. Even compelling forensic evidence must be presented according to established legal standards. Procedural fairness remains essential regardless of the seriousness of the crime or the strength of the evidence. This commitment to due process reinforces public confidence in both scientific evidence and judicial decision-making. Forensic laboratories continue studying the investigation because it illustrates the remarkable evolution of DNA science over several decades. When the murders occurred in 1987, routine forensic DNA profiling had only begun to emerge as a practical investigative tool. By the time investigators identified William Earl Talbot C. Enman, laboratory capabilities had advanced dramatically. Scientists could generate highly informative DNA profiles from preserved biological material, compare those profiles using sophisticated statistical methods, and integrate genetic findings into broader investigative strategies. The investigation therefore documents not only the history of one criminal case, but also the rapid development of modern forensic biology itself. Educational institutions have likewise embraced the case as a multidisciplinary teaching resource. Criminal justice programs examine investigative strategy and cold case management. Forensic science students analyze laboratory methodology, evidence preservation, and DNA interpretation. Law schools discuss constitutional procedure, appellate review, and evidentiary standards. Genealogy specialists evaluate the documented family tree research conducted during the investigation. The case illustrates how multiple professional disciplines contribute simultaneously to successful criminal investigations, reinforcing the value of interdisciplinary cooperation in modern law enforcement. The experiences of the victims' families have also informed contemporary victim advocacy practices. Investigators maintain communication with relatives over many years, recognizing that unresolved homicide investigations continue affecting families long after public attention fades. This sustained engagement reflected an evolving understanding that families should remain informed participants in the investigative process whenever appropriate. Modern cold case units increasingly integrate victim advocates into investigative teams, ensuring that survivors and relatives receive consistent information and support throughout lengthy investigations. The Cook van Cuylenborg investigation serves as an important example of this long-term commitment. From an international perspective, the investigation highlighted the effectiveness of cross-border law enforcement cooperation. Canadian and American authorities exchanged investigative information, coordinated forensic efforts, and maintained communication despite operating within separate legal systems. Such cooperation proved essential because the victim's journey began in British Columbia before the crimes occurred in Washington state. The successful coordination between agencies demonstrated that jurisdictional boundaries need not impede complex homicide investigations when professional collaboration remains a priority. Perhaps the most enduring message emerging from the investigation concerns the nature of justice itself. More than 30 years separated the murders from the final legal resolution. During that period, investigators retired, scientific disciplines evolved, legal standards developed, and investigative technologies changed dramatically. Yet one element remained constant throughout every stage of the case: the commitment to preserving evidence and pursuing verified facts regardless of how much time had passed. That persistence ultimately transformed a case once considered unsolvable into one of the defining examples of modern cold case investigation. Today, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya van Cuylenborg continue to influence forensic science, criminal investigation, legal education, and evidence management throughout North America and beyond. The investigation reminds professionals that scientific innovation achieves its greatest value when combined with meticulous evidence preservation, objective investigative reasoning, interdisciplinary cooperation, and unwavering adherence to legal principles. It also demonstrates that while technology will continue advancing in ways difficult to predict, the fundamental responsibilities of investigators remain unchanged. Collect evidence carefully, document facts accurately, preserve material with integrity, and remain prepared for the possibility that tomorrow's science may finally answer questions that today's investigators cannot yet resolve. In that enduring lesson lies the lasting legacy of one of the Pacific Northwest's most important cold case investigations. As years have passed since the legal resolution of the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg, the investigation continues to occupy an important place in the broader history of forensic science and criminal investigation. It is remembered not simply because an offender was identified after more than 3 decades, but because the case demonstrated how the combined efforts of multiple generations of investigators can ultimately succeed where immediate investigative methods could not. Every stage of the inquiry, from the original crime scene examinations in 1987 to the application of investigative genetic genealogy decades, later illustrates the cumulative nature of professional homicide investigation. The resolution did not result from a single discovery, but from the steady accumulation of carefully preserved evidence, disciplined investigative review, scientific progress, and lawful judicial process. The investigation has become particularly influential in discussions concerning long-term evidence preservation. Forensic laboratories frequently reference the case when emphasizing why biological evidence should be retained whenever legally and practically possible. In 1987, investigators could not foresee the scientific developments that would occur during the following 30 years. Nevertheless, by collecting biological material carefully, maintaining chain of custody documentation, and preserving evidence according to accepted standards, they ensured that future scientists would have the opportunity to re-examine those materials using technologies unavailable at the time. The investigation therefore reinforces an important principle within forensic science. Evidence often retains investigative value far beyond the capabilities of contemporary laboratory methods. Equally significant is the investigation's demonstration of institutional continuity. During more than 3 decades of investigative activity, numerous detectives, laboratory scientists, prosecutors, and support personnel participated in the case. Many retired before the investigation reached its conclusion, while others assumed responsibility years after the original crimes occurred. This transition required exceptional documentation. Every witness interview, forensic examination, investigative decision, and evidentiary procedure had to be recorded with sufficient clarity that future investigators could understand the work completed by their predecessors. The case illustrates that successful cold case investigations depend not only upon individual expertise, but also upon institutions capable of preserving investigative knowledge across generations. The role of forensic DNA analysis also continues to receive considerable professional attention. Although DNA evidence ultimately played a central role in identifying the offender, investigators consistently emphasized that scientific analysis functions most effectively when integrated with traditional detective work. Crime scene examination, witness interviews, timeline reconstruction, documentary research, and legal preparation all remained indispensable throughout the investigation. DNA analysis provided a powerful investigative tool, but it did not replace the broader investigative framework required to transform scientific findings into admissible evidence presented within a court of law. This balanced understanding has influenced training programs throughout the criminal justice system. Investigative genetic genealogy remains another important aspect of the case's legacy. Since the identification of William Earl Talbot Tefft, law enforcement agencies have continued refining policies governing the responsible use of genealogical databases in serious violent crime investigations. Professional guidance increasingly emphasizes transparency, judicial oversight where required, respect for applicable privacy policies, and the necessity of independent forensic confirmation before criminal charges are pursued. The Cook-Van Quillenborg investigation is frequently cited because it demonstrates these principles in practice. Genealogical analysis generated an investigative lead, while traditional forensic DNA comparison and subsequent investigative work established the evidentiary foundation supporting prosecution. The legal proceedings themselves also provide important educational value. Criminal procedure requires not only accurate investigative work, but also careful adherence to evidentiary rules and constitutional protections throughout every stage of prosecution. The appellate review that resulted in a new trial order illustrated that procedural safeguards remain essential regardless of the seriousness of the offense or the strength of scientific evidence. Ultimately, the criminal proceedings concluded through guilty pleas, bringing legal finality to the investigation while reinforcing the principle that criminal convictions must satisfy both factual and procedural requirements. Legal scholars frequently examine the case when discussing the interaction between emerging scientific methods and long-standing constitutional protections. Victim advocacy professionals likewise regard the investigation as an important example of long-term engagement with affected families. For more than 30 years, relatives of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remained connected to the investigation despite the absence of immediate investigative breakthroughs. Detectives maintained communication whenever meaningful developments occurred, providing updates regarding scientific advances, renewed investigative efforts, and eventual legal proceedings. Modern victim-centered investigative practice increasingly recognizes that maintaining these relationships contributes not only to public trust but also to the dignity and respect owed to families affected by violent crime. The investigation further illustrates the importance of cooperation across multiple jurisdictions. Because the victims began their journey in British Columbia before traveling into Washington state, Canadian and American law enforcement agencies shared investigative information throughout the inquiry. Cross-border cooperation required effective communication, mutual professional respect, and coordinated investigative strategy despite differing legal systems and administrative structures. The successful partnership demonstrated that complex violent crime investigations often benefit significantly from sustained international collaboration, particularly in regions where routine cross-border travel creates overlapping investigative responsibilities. Within professional education, the case continues serving as an interdisciplinary resource. Police academies examine the investigation when discussing homicide investigation, evidence preservation, and cold case review procedures. Forensic science programs analyze laboratory methods, DNA interpretation, and quality assurance standards demonstrated throughout the case. Universities teaching criminal justice explore investigative strategy, while law schools examine appellate procedure and evidentiary issues arising during prosecution. Even genealogy professionals study the documented family tree research that contributed to the investigative process. Few homicide investigations have influenced such a broad range of professional disciplines simultaneously. Perhaps the investigation's most enduring lesson concerns patience. Modern criminal investigations often emphasize rapid identification of offenders through advanced technology, surveillance systems, and digital evidence. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remind investigators that some cases unfold on a much longer timeline. Scientific innovation cannot always be predicted. Witnesses may emerge years later, and preserved evidence can acquire new significance as laboratory methods improve. Experienced detectives therefore recognize that unresolved investigations should not be viewed as abandoned investigations. Instead, they remain active opportunities awaiting new information, improved scientific capabilities, or fresh investigative perspectives. Today, the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation stands as one of the defining examples of modern cold case resolution. It demonstrates that justice often depends upon the collective efforts of many individuals working across decades rather than the actions of a single investigator or scientific breakthrough. Careful evidence collection, disciplined documentation, rigorous forensic analysis, lawful investigative practice, interdisciplinary cooperation, and sustained commitment all contributed to the eventual outcome. The investigation continues informing professional practice throughout North America, encouraging law enforcement agencies to preserve evidence meticulously, review historical cases systematically, embrace validated scientific advances responsibly, and maintain confidence that even the oldest investigations may one day yield answers. In doing so, the legacy of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg extends beyond their own case, providing guidance and hope for countless other unresolved homicide investigations still awaiting resolution. More than 3 decades after Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg left British Columbia expecting nothing more than a routine trip to Washington state, their investigation had evolved from an unsolved double homicide into one of the defining examples of modern cold case resolution. Yet the lasting importance of the case cannot be measured solely by the identification of the offender or the eventual legal proceedings. Its broader significance lies in the professional lessons it continues to offer investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, educators, and policymakers who confront unresolved violent crimes throughout the world. The investigation demonstrates that while technology can transform criminal investigations, lasting success still depends upon the consistent application of fundamental investigative principles. One of the clearest lessons concerns the relationship between time and evidence. Conventional wisdom sometimes assumes that the passage of years inevitably weakens criminal investigations. Witnesses forget details, physical locations change, and investigative personnel retire. While these realities certainly present challenges, the Cook-Van Quillenborg investigation illustrates another perspective. Properly preserved forensic evidence does not necessarily lose investigative value simply because decades have passed. In some circumstances, the opposite may be true. As scientific methods improve, evidence collected years earlier may reveal information that investigators could not possibly have obtained during the original investigation. Time, when combined with careful preservation and scientific progress, can occasionally strengthen rather than diminish an investigation. This principle has significantly influenced evidence retention policies. Law enforcement agencies increasingly recognize that biological evidence should be maintained whenever legally appropriate, particularly in homicide investigations where future technological advances may provide additional opportunities for analysis. Modern evidence management systems emphasize environmental protection, digital documentation, inventory accountability, and rigorous chain of custody procedures. These administrative practices may appear routine, yet the Cook-Van Quillen